The Scarecrow of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 21. Narrated by Riccardo. Dorothy, Betsy and Ozma. I suppose many of my readers have read descriptions of the beautiful and magnificent Emerald City of Oz, so I need not describe it here, except to state that never has any city in any fairyland ever equalled this one in stately splendour. It lies almost exactly in the centre of the land of Oz, and in the centre of the Emerald City rises the wall of glistening emeralds that surrounds the palace of Ozma. The palace is almost the city in itself, and is inhabited by many of the ruler's especial friends, and those who have won her confidence and favour. As for Ozma herself, there are no words in any dictionary I can find that are fitted to describe this young girl's beauty of mind and person. Merely to see her is to love her for her charming face and manners. To know her is to love her for her tender sympathy, her generous nature, her truth and honour. Born of a long line of fairy queens, Ozma is as nearly perfect as any fairy may be, and she is noted for her wisdom as well as for her other qualities. Her happy subjects adore their girl ruler, and each one considers her a comrade and protector. At the time of which I write, Ozma's best friend and most constant companion was a little Kansas girl named Dorothy, a mortal who had come to the land of Oz in a very curious manner, and had been offered a home in Ozma's palace. Furthermore, Dorothy had been made a princess of Oz, and was as much at home in the royal palace as was the gentle ruler. She knew almost every part of the great country, and almost all of its numerous inhabitants. Next to Ozma, she was loved better than anyone in all Oz, for Dorothy was simple and sweet, seldom became angry, and had such a friendly, charming way that she made friends wherever she wandered. It was she who first brought the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman and the Cowardly Lion to the Emerald City. Dorothy had also introduced to Ozma the Shaggy Man and the Hungry Tiger, as well as Billina the Yellow Hen, Eureka the Pink Kitten, and many other delightful characters and creatures. Coming as she did from our world, Dorothy was much like many other girls we know, so there were times when she was not so wise as she might have been, and other times when she was obstinate and got herself into trouble. But life in a fairyland had taught the little girl to accept all sorts of surprising things as matters of course, for while Dorothy was no fairy, but just as mortal as we are, she had seen more wonders than most mortals ever do. Another little girl from our outside world also lived in Ozma's palace. This was Betsy Bobbin, whose strange adventures had brought her to the Emerald City, where Ozma had cordially welcomed her. Betsy was a shy little thing, and could never get used to the marvels that surrounded her, but she and Dorothy were firm friends, and thought themselves very fortunate in being together in this delightful country. One day Dorothy and Betsy were visiting Ozma in the girl ruler's private apartment, and among the things that especially interested them was Ozma's magic picture, set in a handsome frame and hung upon the wall of the room. This picture was a magic one, because it constantly changed its scenes and showed events and adventures happening in all parts of the world. Thus it was really a moving picture of life, and if the one who stood before it wished to know what any absent person was doing, the picture instantly showed that person with his or her surroundings. The two girls were not wishing to see anyone in particular on this occasion, but merely enjoyed watching the shifting scenes, some of which were exceedingly curious and remarkable. Suddenly Dorothy exclaimed,
"Why, there's Button-Bright!"
and this drew Ozma also to look at the picture, for she and Dorothy knew the boy well.
"Who is Button-Bright?"
asked Betsy, who had never met him.
"Why, he's the little boy who is just getting off the back of that strange flying creature,"
exclaimed Dorothy. Then she turned to Ozma and asked,
"What is that thing, Ozma? A bird? I've never seen anything like it before."
"It is an auk,"
answered Ozma, for they were watching the scene where the orc and the three big birds were first landing their passengers in Jinxland after the long flight across the desert.
"I wonder,"
added the girl ruler musingly,
"why those strangers dare venture into that unfortunate country, which is ruled by a wicked king."
That girl and the one-legged man seem to be mortals from the outside world,
said Dorothy.
The man isn't one-legged.
Corrected Betsy.
He has one wooden leg.
It's almost as bad,
declared Dorothy, watching Cap'n Bill stamp around.
"They are three mortal adventurers,"
said Ozma.
"and they seem worthy and honest. But I fear they will be treated badly in Jinxland, and if they meet with any misfortune there it will reflect badly upon me, for Jinxland is a part of my dominions."
Can't we help them in any way?
Inquired Dorothy.
That seems like a nice little girl. I'd be sorry if anything happened to her.
"Let us watch the picture for a while,"
suggested Ozma, and so they all drew chairs before the magic picture and followed the adventures of Trot and Cap'n Bill and Button-Bright. Presently the scene shifted and showed their friend the Scarecrow crossing the mountains into Jinxland, and that somewhat relieved Ozma's anxiety, for she knew at once that Glinda the Good had sent the Scarecrow to protect the strangers. The adventures in Jinxland proved very interesting to the three girls in Ozma's palace, who during the succeeding days spent much of their time in watching the picture. It was like a story to them.
That girl's a regular trump,
exclaimed Dorothy, referring to Trot, and Ozma answered,
"She's a dear little thing, and I am sure nothing very bad will happen to her. The old sailor is a fine character too, for he has never once grumbled over being a grasshopper, as so many would have done."
When the Scarecrow was so nearly burned up, the girls all shivered a little, and they clapped their hands in joy when the Flach of orcs came and saved him. So it was that when all the exciting adventures in Jinxland were over, and the four orcs had begun their flights across the mountains to carry the mortals into the land of Oz, Ozma called the wizard to her and asked him to prepare a place for the strangers to sleep. The famous Wizard of Oz was a quaint little man who inhabited the royal palace and attended to all the magical things that Ozma wanted done. He was not as powerful as Glinda, to be sure, but he could do a great many wonderful things. He proved this by placing a house in the uninhabited part of the Quadling country, where the orcs landed Cap'n Bill and Trot and Button-Bright, and fitting it with all the comforts I have described in the last chapter. Next morning Dorothy said to Ozma,
"Oughtn't we go to meet the strangers, so we can show them the way to the Emerald City? I'm sure that little girl will feel shy in this beautiful land, and I know if 'twas me I'd like somebody to give me a welcome."
Ozma smiled at her little friend and answered,
"You and Betsy may go to meet them, if you wish, but I cannot leave my palace just now, as I am to have a conference with Jack Pumpkinhead and Professor Wogglebug on important matters. You may take the Sawhorse and the Red Wagon, and if you start soon you will be able to meet the Scarecrow and the strangers at Glinda's palace."
"Oh, thank you!"
cried Dorothy, and went away to tell Betsy and to make preparations for the journey. End of chapter 21.
The Scarecrow of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 22, narrated by Scott Sherris, Atlanta, Georgia, USA. The Scarecrow of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 22, The Waterfall. Glinda's castle was a long way from the mountains, but the Scarecrow began the journey cheerfully, since time was of no great importance in the land of Oz, and he had recently made the trip and knew the way. It never mattered much to Button-Bright where he was or what he was doing. The boy was content in being alive and having good companions to share his wanderings. As for Trot and Cap'n Bill, they now found themselves so comfortable and free from danger in this fine fairyland, and they were so awed and amazed by the adventures they were encountering, that the journey to Glinda's castle was more like a pleasure trip than a hardship, so many wonderful things were there to see. Button-Bright had been in Oz before, but never in this part of it, so the Scarecrow was the only one who knew the paths and could lead them. They had eaten a hearty breakfast, which they found already prepared for them and awaiting them on the table when they arose from their refreshing sleep, so they left the magic house in a contented mood and with hearts lighter and more happy than they had known for many a day. As they marched along through the fields, the sun shone brightly and the breeze was laden with delicious fragrance, for it carried with it the breath of millions of wildflowers. At noon, when they stopped to rest by the bank of a pretty river, Trot said with a long-drawn breath that was much like a sigh,
"I wish we'd brought with us some of the food that was left from our breakfast, for I'm getting hungry again."
Scarcely had she spoken when a table rose up before them, as if from the ground itself, and it was loaded with fruits and nuts and cakes and many other good things to eat. The little girl's eyes opened wide at this display of magic, and Cap'n Bill was not sure that the things were actually there and fit to eat until he had taken them in his hand and tasted them. But the Scarecrow said with a laugh,
"Someone is looking after your welfare, that is certain. And from the looks of this table, I suspect my friend the wizard has taken us in his charge. I've known him to do things like this before. And if we are in the wizard's care, you need not worry about your future."
"Who's worrying?"
inquired Button-Bright, already at the table and busily eating. The Scarecrow looked around the place while the others were feasting, and finding many things unfamiliar to him, he shook his head and remarked,
"I must have taken the wrong path back in that last valley, for on my way to Jinxland I remember that I passed around the foot of this river, where there was a great waterfall."
"Did the river make a bend after the waterfall?"
asked Cap'n Bill.
"No, the river disappeared. Only a pool of whirling water showed what had become of the river. But I suppose it is underground somewhere and will come to the surface again in another part of the country."
"Well,"
suggested Trot as she finished her luncheon,
"as there's no way to cross this river, I suppose we'll have to find that waterfall and go around it."
"Exactly,"
replied the Scarecrow. So they soon renewed their journey, following the river for a long time until the roar of the waterfall sounded in their ears. By and by they came to the waterfall itself, a sheet of silver dropping far, far down into a tiny lake, which seemed to have no outlet. From the top of the fall where they stood, the banks gradually sloped away, so that the descent by land was quite easy, while the river could do nothing but glide over an edge of rock and tumble straight down to the depths below.
"You see,"
said the Scarecrow, leaning over the brink,
"this is called by our Oz people the Great Waterfall, because it is certainly the highest one on all the land. But I think— Help!"
He had lost his balance and pitched head foremost into the river. They saw a flash of straw and blue clothes, and the painted face looking upward in surprise. The next moment the Scarecrow was swept over the waterfall and plunged into the basin below. The accident had happened so suddenly that for a moment they were all too horrified to speak or move.
"Quick, we must help him or he'll be drowned!"
Trot exclaimed. Even while speaking, she began to descend the bank to the pool below, and Cap'n Bill followed as swiftly as his wooden leg would let him. Button-Bright came more slowly, calling to the girl,
"He can't drown, Trot. He's a scarecrow."
But she wasn't sure a Scarecrow couldn't drown, and never relaxed her speed until she stood on the edge of the pool, with the spray dashing in her face. Cap'n Bill, puffing and panting, had just voice enough to ask as he reached her side,
"See him, Trot?"
"Not a speck of him. Oh, Captain, what do you suppose has become of him?"
"I suppose,"
replied the sailor,
"that he's in that water, more or less far down, and I'm afraid it'll make his straw pretty soggy. But as for his being drowned, I agree with Button-Bright that it can't be done."
There was small comfort in this assurance, and Trot stood for some time searching with her eyes the bubbling water, in the hope that the Scarecrow would finally come to the surface. Presently she heard Button-Bright calling,
"Come here, Trot."
And looking around she saw that the boy had crept over the wet rocks to the edge of the waterfall, and seemed to be peering behind it. Making her way toward him, she asked,
"What do you see?"
"A cave."
He answered.
"Let's go in. Perhaps we'll find the Scarecrow there."
She was a little doubtful of that, but the cave interested her, and so did it Cap'n Bill. There was just space enough at the edge of the sheet of water for them to crowd in behind it, but after that dangerous entrance they found room enough to walk upright, and after a time they came to an opening in the wall of rock. Approaching this opening, they gazed within it and found a series of steps, cut so that they might easily descend into the cavern. Trot turned to look inquiringly at her companions. The falling water made such din and roaring that her voice could not be heard. Cap'n Bill nodded his head, but before he could enter the cave, Button-Bright was before him, clambering down the steps without a particle of fear, so the others followed the boy. The first steps were wet with spray and slippery, but the remainder were quite dry. A rosy light seemed to come from the interior of the cave, and this lighted their way. After the steps there was a short tunnel, high enough for them to walk erect in, and then they reached the cave itself and paused in wonder and admiration. They stood on the edge of a vast cavern, the walls and domed roof of which were lined with countless rubies, exquisitely cut and flashing sparkling rays from one to another. This caused a radiant light that permitted the entire cavern to be distinctly seen, and the effect was so marvelous that Trot drew in her breath with a sort of a gasp, and stood quite still in wonder. But the walls and roof of the cavern were merely a setting for a more wonderful scene. In the center was a bubbling cauldron of water, for here the river rose again, splashing and dashing till its spray rose high in the air, where it took the ruby color of the jewels and seemed like a seething mass of flame. And while they gazed into the tumbling, tossing water, the body of the Scarecrow suddenly rose in the center, struggling and kicking, and the next instant wholly disappeared from view.
My, but he's wet,
exclaimed Button-Bright, but none of the others heard him. Trot and Cap'n Bill discovered that a broad ledge, covered like the walls with glittering rubies, ran all around the cavern, so they followed this gorgeous path to the rear and found where the water made its final dive underground before it disappeared entirely. Where it plunged into this dim abyss the river was black and dreary looking, and they stood gazing in awe until just beside them the body of the Scarecrow again popped up from the water. End of chapter 22.
The Scarecrow of Oz, Chapter 23. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Scarecrow of Oz by L. Frank Baum, Chapter 23. Narrated by Kara Shallenberg. The Land of Oz. The straw man's appearance on the water was so sudden that it startled Trot, but Cap'n Bill had the presence of mind to stick his wooden leg out over the water, and the Scarecrow made a desperate clutch, and grabbed the leg with both hands. He managed to hold on until Trot and Button-Bright knelt down and seized his clothing, but the children would have been powerless to drag the soaked Scarecrow ashore, had not Cap'n Bill now assisted them. When they laid him on the ledge of rubies, he was the most useless-looking Scarecrow you can imagine. His straw sodden and dripping with water, his clothing wet and crumpled, while even the sack upon which his face was painted had become so wrinkled that the jolly old expression of their stuffed friend's features was entirely gone. But he could still speak, and when Trot bent down her ear she heard him say,
"Get me out of here as soon as you can."
That seemed a wise thing to do, so Cap'n Bill lifted his head and shoulders, and Trot and Button-Bright each took a leg. Among them they partly carried and partly dragged the damp Scarecrow out of the ruby cavern, along the tunnel, and up the flight of rock steps. It was somewhat difficult to get him past the edge of the waterfall, but they succeeded, after much effort, and a few minutes later laid their poor comrade on a grassy bank where the sun shone upon him freely, and he was beyond the reach of the spray. Cap'n Bill now knelt down and examined the straw that the Scarecrow was stuffed with.
"I don't believe it'll be of much use to him any more,"
said he,
"for it's full of pollywogs and fish eggs, and the water has took all the crinkle out of the straw and ruined it. I guess, Trot, that the best thing for us to do is to empty out all his body and carry his head and clothes along the road till we come to a field or a house where we can get some fresh straw."
Yes, Captain.
she agreed.
There's nothing else to be done. But how shall we ever find the road to Glinda's palace without the Scarecrow to guide us?
That's easy,
said the Scarecrow, speaking in a rather feeble but distinct voice.
If Cap'n Bill will carry my head on his shoulders, eyes front, I can tell him which way to go.
So they followed that plan, and emptied all the old wet straw out of the Scarecrow's body. Then the sailor-man wrung out the clothes, and laid them in the sun till they were quite dry. Trot took charge of the head, and pressed the wrinkles out of the face as it dried, so that after a while the Scarecrow's expression became natural again, and as jolly as before. This work consumed some time, but when it was completed they again started upon their journey, Button-Bright carrying the boots and hat, Trot the bundle of clothes, and Cap'n Bill the head. The Scarecrow, having regained his composure, and being now in a good humour, despite his recent mishaps, beguiled their way with stories of the land of Oz. It was not until the next morning, however, that they found straw with which to restuff the Scarecrow. That evening they came to the same little house they had slept in before, only now it was magically transferred to a new place. The same bountiful supper as before was found smoking hot upon the table, and the same cosy beds were ready for them to sleep in. They rose early, and after breakfast went out of doors, and there, lying just beside the house, was a heap of clean, crisp straw. Ozma had noticed the Scarecrow's accident in her magic picture, and had notified the wizard to provide the straw, for she knew the adventurers were not likely to find straw in the country through which they were now travelling. They lost no time in stuffing the Scarecrow anew, and he was greatly delighted at being able to walk around again, and to assume the leadership of the little party.
Really?
Said Trot.
I think you're better than you were before, for you are fresh and sweet all through, and rustle beautifully when you move.
Thank you, my dear,
he replied gratefully.
I always feel like a new man when I'm freshly stuffed. No one likes to get musty, you know, and even good straw may be spoiled by age.
It was water that spoiled you the last time,
remarked Button-Bright,
which proves that too much bathing is as bad as too little. But after all, Scarecrow, water is not as dangerous for you as fire.
All things are good in moderation,
declared the Scarecrow.
But now let us hurry on, or we shall not reach Glinda's palace by nightfall.
End of chapter 23.
The Scarecrow of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 24, narrated by Scott Sherris, Atlanta, Georgia, USA. The Scarecrow of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 24, The Royal Reception. At about 4 o'clock of that same day, the red wagon drew up at the entrance to Glinda's palace, and Dorothy and Betsy jumped out. Ozma's red wagon was almost a chariot, being inlaid with rubies and pearls, and it was drawn by Ozma's favorite steed, the wooden sawhorse.
Shall I unharness you?
Asked Dorothy.
So you can come in and visit?
No,
replied the sawhorse.
I'll just stand here and think. Take your time. Thinking doesn't seem to bore me at all.
What will you think of?
Inquired Betsy.
Of the acorn that grew the tree from which I was made.
So they left the wooden animal and went in to see Glinda, who welcomed the little girls in her most cordial manner.
I knew you were on your way,
said the good sorceress when they were seated in her library,
for I learned from my record book that you intended to meet Trot and Button-Bright on their arrival here.
Is the strange little girl named Trot?
Asked Dorothy.
Yes, and her companion, the old sailor, is named Cap'n Bill. I think we shall like them very much, for they are just the kind of people to enjoy and appreciate our fairyland, and I do not see any way at present for them to return again to the outside world.
Well, there's room enough here for them, I'm sure,
said Dorothy.
Betsy and I are already eager to welcome Trot. It'll keep us busy for a year, at least, showing her all the wonderful things in Oz.
Glinda smiled.
"I have lived here many years,"
said she,
"and I have not seen all the wonders of Oz yet."
Meantime, the travelers were drawing near to the palace, and when they first caught sight of its towers, Trot realized that it was far more grand and imposing than was the king's castle in Jinxland. The nearer they came, the more beautiful the palace appeared, and when finally the Scarecrow led them up the great marble steps, even Button-Bright was filled with awe.
"I don't see any soldiers to guard the place,"
said the little girl.
"There is no need to guard Glinda's palace,"
replied the Scarecrow.
"We have no wicked people in Oz that we know of, and even if there were any, Glinda's magic would be powerful enough to protect her."
Button-Bright was now standing on the top steps of the entrance, and he suddenly exclaimed,
"Why, there's the Sawhorse and the red wagon! Hip hooray!"
And next moment he was rushing down to throw his arms around the neck of the wooden horse, which good-naturedly permitted this familiarity when it recognized in the boy an old friend. Button-Bright's shout had been heard inside the palace, so now Dorothy and Betsy came running out to embrace their beloved friend, the Scarecrow, and to welcome Trot and Cap'n Bill to the land of Oz.
"We've been watching you for a long time, in Ozma's magic picture,"
said Dorothy.
"and Ozma has sent us to invite you to her own palace in the Emerald City. I don't know if you realize how lucky you are to get that invitation, but you'll understand it better after you've seen the royal palace and the Emerald City."
Glinda now appeared in person to lead all the party into her azure reception room. Trot was a little afraid of the stately sorceress, but gained courage by holding fast to the hands of Betsy and Dorothy. Cap'n Bill had no one to help him feel at ease, so the old sailor sat stiffly on the edge of his chair and said,
"Yes, ma'am,"
or
"No, ma'am,"
when he was spoken to, and was greatly embarrassed by so much splendor. The Scarecrow had lived so much in palaces that he felt quite at home, and he chatted to Glinda and the Oz girls in a merry, light-hearted way. He told all about his adventures in Jinxland, and at the Great Waterfall, and on the journey hither, most of which his hearers knew already, and then he asked Dorothy and Betsy what had happened in the Emerald City since he had left there. They all passed the evening and the night at Glinda's palace, and the sorceress was so gracious to Cap'n Bill that the old man by degrees regained his self-possession and began to enjoy himself. Trot had already come to the conclusion that in Dorothy and Betsy she had found two delightful comrades, and Button-Bright was just as much at home here as he had been in the fields of Jinxland or when he was buried in the popcorn snow of the land of Mo. The next morning they arose bright and early, and after breakfast bade goodbye to the kind sorceress, whom Trot and Cap'n Bill thanked earnestly for sending the Scarecrow to Jinxland to rescue them. Then they all climbed into the red wagon. There was room for all on the broad seats, and when all had taken their places, Dorothy, Trot, and Betsy on the rear seat, and Cap'n Bill, Button-Bright, and the Scarecrow in front, they called, "Giddy-ap!" to the Sawhorse, and the wooden steed moved briskly away, pulling the red wagon with ease. It was now that the strangers began to perceive the real beauties of the land of Oz, for they were passing through a more thickly settled part of the country, and the population grew more dense as they drew nearer to the Emerald City. Everyone they met had a cheery word or a smile for the Scarecrow, Dorothy, or Betsy Bobbin, and some of them remembered Button-Bright and welcomed him back to their country. It was a happy party indeed that journeyed in the red wagon to the Emerald City, and Trot already began to hope that Ozma would permit her and Cap'n Bill to live always in the land of Oz. When they reached the great city they were more amazed than ever, both by the concourse of people in their quaint and picturesque costumes, and by the splendor of the city itself. But the magnificence of the royal palace quite took their breath away, until Ozma received them in her own pretty apartment, and by her charming manners and assuring smiles made them feel they were no longer strangers. Trot was given a lovely little room next to that of Dorothy, while Cap'n Bill had the coziest sort of a room next to Trot's and overlooking the gardens. And that evening Ozma gave a grand banquet and reception in honor of the new arrivals. While Trot had read of many of the people she then met, Cap'n Bill was less familiar with them, and many of the unusual characters introduced to him that evening caused the old sailor to open his eyes wide in astonishment. He had thought the live Scarecrow about as curious as anyone could be, but now he met the Tin Woodman, who was all made of tin, even to his heart, and carried a gleaming axe over his shoulder wherever he went. Then there was Jack Pumpkinhead, whose head was a real pumpkin with a face carved upon it, and Professor Wogglebug, who had the shape of an enormous bug, but was dressed in neat-fitting garments. The professor was an interesting talker and had very polite manners, but his face was so comical that it made Cap'n Bill smile to look at it. A great friend of Dorothy and Ozma seemed to be a machine man called Tik-Tok, who ran down several times during the evening and had to be wound up again by someone before he could move or speak. At the reception appeared the Shaggy Man and his brother, both very popular in Oz, as well as Dorothy's Uncle Henry and Aunt Em, two happy old people who lived in a pretty cottage near the palace. But what perhaps seemed most surprising to both Trot and Cap'n Bill was the number of peculiar animals admitted into Ozma's parlors, where they not only conducted themselves quite properly, but were able to talk as well as anyone. There was the Cowardly Lion, an immense beast with a beautiful mane, and the Hungry Tiger, who smiled continually, and Eureka the pink kitten, who lay curled upon a cushion and had rather supercilious manners, and the wooden sawhorse, and 9 tiny piglets that belonged to the Wizard, and a mule named Hank who belonged to Betsy Bobbin. A fuzzy little terrier dog named Toto lay at Dorothy's feet, but seldom took part in the conversation, although he listened to every word that was said. But the most wonderful of all to Trot was a square beast with a winning smile that squatted in a corner of the room and wagged his square head at everyone in quite a jolly way. Betsy told Trot that this unique beast was called the Woozy, and there was no other like him in all the world. Cap'n Bill and Trot had both looked around expectantly for the Wizard of Oz, but the evening was far advanced before the famous little man entered the room. But he went up to the strangers at once and said,
"I know you, but you don't know me, so let's get acquainted."
And they did get acquainted in a very short time, and before the evening was over, Trot felt that she knew every person and animal present at the reception, and that they were all her good friends. Suddenly they looked around for Button-Bright, but he was nowhere to be found.
"Dear me!"
cried Trot.
"He's lost again."
"Never mind, my dear,"
said Ozma with her charming smile.
"No one can go far astray in the land of Oz. And Button-Bright isn't lost occasionally. He isn't happy."
End of The Scarecrow of Oz by L. Frank Baum.
Cap'n Bill performed by Robert Flach. www.allauthors.com.
The Scarecrow of Oz. Michael Yard, Tucson, Arizona.
Pessum recorded by Kevin McAsh, Ontario, Canada.
The part of Googly Goo was played by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina.
Trot, read by Kirsten Ferreri, Los Angeles, California.
Blinky,
read by Ezwa.
Gloria, read by Stephanie König.
Betsy Bobbin, read by Allyson Hester of Athens, Georgia.
The Orc, read by Claire Goget.
The part of Castleguard, read by Jason Isbell, shabamdevelopment.com.
The part of the Sawhorse was read by
Jamie Wilking.
Ozma of Oz, read by Lizzie Driver.
The part of King Krewl was performed by Ken Crooker, on the web at kencrooker.com.
Pon was performed by Chip Joel, Westchester, New York, www.thevocalguy.com.
Bumpy Man, performed by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina, www.techsmiths.blogspot.com.
Dorothy was performed by Susie G.
Button-Bright was performed by Henry Frigon, San Diego, California.
Proof listening provided by Anneliga.